Welcome back to another review. I thought I'd have a look at the Minolta 70 to 210mm f4 lens. All the specs and details are on the screen for you to have a look at. One of the original lenses that Minolta made for the autofocus system in the mid-80s, and it was in production into the 90s. I'm not exactly sure when. It's one of the nicest quality lenses of this era. You have a metal case. Everything else is very solid and rugged, and this particular lens is quite a few years old, so it has stood the test of time. The name Beercan comes from the fact that the lens is basically exactly the same size as a can of beer when it's focus extended. Typical for the early Minoltas, you have quite a narrow focus ring at the front, and what happens is it does rotate the front element, and the barrel also extends slightly when you're doing that. So if you're using a polarizing filter, that could be a little bit of an issue for you. Although this lens is quite a few years old, the internals on this lens are also metal, so it has stood the test of time. You'll notice that the macro marking is at the 210mm mark, and it goes down to a quarter magnification, which is quite good for a lens of this class. Zooming mechanism is internal, so there's nothing to extend. The elements move around inside. Just to give you a close-up with some of the markings on the barrel, this particular version is in very nice condition. One thing to check for with these lenses is some of them can have sticky aperture blades, so make sure you do a check on that. Open it up with your finger and then release. It should snap back into place very quickly. As I said, there are a lot of these around, so you can afford to be picky. Ignore anything with fungus or obvious damage, but that is one of the problems that I've seen on some of the early lenses. Earlier versions of this lens had a metal lens hood. This particular one is plastic. It's a later version, and it has the tabs on the side, so it's a snap-on type. I much prefer this to the bayonet style ones. It's just quicker and easier to remove the hood. On the Film 7 body I have this came out in 2000, so it's quite a bit newer than the lens, and you'll see the focus speeds are moderate on this. It's about average for a telephoto lens, screw driven from the body, so you may find the more modern lenses would definitely have an edge in terms of focus speed, but it is acceptable. Depending on the camera that you're using, that will affect the performance. There is a bit of weight to this lens, but not nearly as much as an f2.8, which would be significantly larger and heavier, and that's one of the advantages with the f4 lenses. It might be good enough for you depending on what type of subject you are shooting. Cost of this lens is around about £50 on the second-hand market, so it is something to consider when we're taking a look at the optical performance. The EXIF does read slightly different to what the lens is set at. It does that on all my bodies. At 70mm in the centre, f4 it is quite sharp, and it's also pretty good in the extreme corners. Not perfect, but it is very good across most of the frame. There is some vignetting wide open on all of these focal ranges. That does clear up quite quickly when you stop the lens down. We're up to the 150mm in the centre is also good, and it's also pretty good in the extreme corners. Going up to the full zoom now at 210mm. Starting off in the centre, the resolution is a little bit less, but it's still pretty good. There's quite a bit of detail there, and the corner resolution is also quite good. A little bit less contrast at the f4 mark. Here's an example of the vignetting at wide open at 210mm. It's not that bad, it's quite mild really. You can see there is an improvement when you stop the lens down in terms of the resolution, but it's still very usable wide open. Let's look at the chromatic aberration, and one thing you will notice with this lens is the purple fringing that you can get in high contrast situations, and it can be quite strong at times. That's in the foreground, and sometimes in the background you can get a sort of green or cyan tint to the edges of images. I don't always see it in all of the images. Sometimes it can be wide open. It does improve the purple fringing stopping down. This would be a worst case scenario that I'm showing you, and it's the main weakness of the lens, to be honest with you, is the chromatic aberration. It can be pretty strong. It's the green which can be a bit tricky to remove in post-processing. Here's another shot that I did just to see what the chromatic aberration is on this, and it's actually very mild. You can really barely see anything on this image. So it can vary considerably with the chromatic aberration. I've used about 3 different copies of this lens, and it has varied amongst those. So not much to see on this particular image. The only purple fringing that I could find was on the corner, which is just near a window frame, and there's a very slight amount of chromatic aberration on that, which would be quite easy to remove. To be honest, I tend to use this lens mainly for portraits. I have shot other subjects with it, but that is a great strength of this type of lens, particularly with the more candid stuff, because it gives you a bit of separation from the subject. Sometimes I have used it for action. It's going to depend on the body. For the focus speeds, it wouldn't be my first pick because they are modest focus speeds compared to some modern lenses, but you can get the job done. Using image stabilization in the body, I'm also able to get really slow shutter speeds with this. I would recommend a faster lens for low light, but it will do the job. The biggest strength that I can find with this lens is the rendition of the outer focus areas. Very smooth. I've always been very pleased with the lens. And you also have quite a nice minimum focus distance on this, so it's pretty good for close-up work. At the 70mm end, flare is reasonably well controlled. You can see a few spots. Once you go up to the 210mm, it's quite a weak performance. You lose a lot of contrast, so I would certainly suggest that you use the lens hood with this. Real world, I haven't had too many problems myself with flare, just something to bear in mind. A lot of these older lenses can be quite poor with flare control. Outer focus areas on lenses can vary significantly depending on the distance of subject and focal length. I've always been very pleased with this lens. It is better at the telephoto end, but it's generally pretty good throughout the range. If you're curious how the lens performs on an APS-C camera, you're getting roughly equivalent to 105 to 315mm lens, and in the middle on a 24 megapixel camera, the details are good on this. The only thing you have to watch with this lens is that you focus it accurately. If it's even slightly off, you will notice the difference. Give you a quick comparison next to the 100 to 200mm Minolta, which I did a review on a few months ago, and there's a significant size difference between these two lenses in terms of the length and the weight. You've also got a larger filter diameter on the 70 to 210mm. There are some differences with them apart from the lens speed. The 210 is a little bit closer in reality, and it is a bit smoother with the outer focus backgrounds. Generally speaking, I use the 100 to 200mm for landscape shots, and I tend to use the Beercan or 70 to 210mm for portraits, but I've used both for different types of activities. I will link to the review that I did on the 100 to 200mm. There are some obvious advantages with size and weight, but some drawbacks also are the minimum focus distance is much further away than the Beercan. So the main takeaway from this is going to be that the chromatic aberration is the only real problem you're going to have with this. The resolution on the lens still holds up very well on a 24 megapixel full frame sensor and is still capable of producing some very nice images.